Welcome back to The Simplicity Effect, where we explore messaging that matters. I'm your host, Tori, and today we're diving into something foundational, yet often misunderstood: privacy. Not as a constraint, but as connective tissue, as my guest likes to describe it, a design principle that shapes better products and stronger customer relationships. Joining me today is Tim de Souza, and he's Managing Director of FTI Consulting. Tim is a senior privacy consultant and former OAIC director. He's been at the front line of privacy, technology and compliance for well over 20 years, both from a public and private perspective. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have him join me today. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Tori. How are you?
I'm great. Ready to dive into the world of privacy and compliance, that's for sure. I mean, it's definitely a hot topic at the moment, especially in Australia. To kick us off, did you want to maybe tell us how you define privacy? Because it does feel a little bit like goalposts are shifting.
I mean, that's mainly because the goalposts are shifting. But for me, privacy is about two things. It's about choice and control. Can I choose what personal information is being collected about me? And can I control how it's being used? There are a couple of ways of looking at this. The way that laws look at it, both in Australia and globally, is around controlling the way that personal information is handled throughout what we call the data lifecycle. So the point where data is collected, to how it's used, to end of life, how you destroy it. And at each stage of that data lifecycle, there are rules around how you can use personal information. So that's quite highly regulated. There are key rules around how you deal with data at every stage there.
So I have heard you speak before, and you've talked about how privacy should be built in and not bolted on. Can you maybe explain what that looks like in practice?
Sure. This brings up the concept of privacy by design, the idea that you should look at your products and services in the design stage and identify proactively any risks around the handling of personal data and build in the mitigations into the design of the product or service. So what that's about is just about being proactive and forward-thinking, identifying where the problems may be, taking a bunch of different views, not just the view that you want, but thinking about how your users will use your product or service, how bad actors may use your product and service, and then building in mitigations and controls to make sure that the personal information that you collect gets used in the way that you intend. When we're thinking about new technologies, especially digital technologies, we often like to talk about like the flexibility and the different choices and the potential. But if that potential exists for us, it also exists for attackers. So that's the lens that we're trying to bring to privacy by design. Like, can we think about how a bad actor or how, a poor user may use your product? For example, I've created a social media network. That's fantastic. Now we can all have a discussion. Great. But we know from many years of social media that the second you create a platform, someone's going to use it to harass somebody. So have I built in controls that enable people to mute users or block users? Do I have any sort of moderation controls that enable me to identify bad actors and prevent them from using the service, or at least restrict them from using the service to hurt people? This is a very common use case, and we still run into those problems every day, every time we create a communications channel. So privacy by design, I think, still has a long way to go in terms of being adopted into the way that we create products and services. But as a privacy professional, I'm seeing a great deal of uptake of the philosophy.
So before we kicked off the podcast, we were having a joke about how, obviously we're going to have all of your voice and, video of you now, and we could kind of, deep fake you into saying all things are fine from a compliance perspective, go for it. What it sounds to me is it's almost like the approach to security, where you kind of have to know that you're going to get breached and it's all about managing it rather than trying to stop it. Would you say that it's kind of a similar concept where you can manage it and try and get to a certain level, but there's not much you can do to completely 100% protect it? Or do you think there is?
I'm not sure I would characterize it quite like that. Can you prevent bad things from happening? No, not with 100% certainty. There's no such thing as perfect security. But if you are proactive in building in controls, in doing risk management, you can reduce the frequency and you can reduce the severity. That's true in cybersecurity. It's also true in privacy breaches as well. But the main factor is thinking about how your product will be used and thinking about how it can be used. There's a difference between what you want and what the wider world will do. And the way that I generally describe this is using a quote from the science fiction author William Gibson, The street finds its own uses for things. It doesn't matter what your intent is. It matters what the potential capability is. And if there is potential in there that you don't want realized, you need to be proactive in thinking about what that looks like, and you need to build in walls to prevent it from being used in that way.
Okay, and often you hear a lot of brands now talking about it being not just about compliance, it's about building trust and potentially a point of differentiation as well. Can you maybe share your thoughts on that?
Sure. Trust is incredibly important for all of us. And it's not just about compliance, although compliance is important, but compliance is a tool used by regulators to promote and encourage and direct better practice. What regulators want, what governments want, is good practice, best practice. They want to see you as a supplier of services doing the best you can to limit harm and to take care of your customers. That's what all the fines are about. That's what all the rules are about. But from a commercial perspective, for most of us, our industries are not unique. We have competitors that do similar or the same things as we do, in which case the only reason our customers will stay with us is if they trust us. Trust becomes the very bedrock of your customer relationship, and without that you have nothing, because if they don't trust you, they can go to another competitor and get a near identical service from them. Trust is really all you've got, and privacy is critical to building that trust. And part of that is because we haven't demonstrated that we're worthy of that trust. You can't just say, don't worry, trust me. You have to prove that you can be trusted. And you can do that by making it clear what you're doing to protect your customers, but also walking the walk, making sure that, say, you have a data breach, that you're prioritizing the well-being of your customers. One of the biggest mistakes I see organizations and governments make when they've had an incident is to immediately move to protect themselves rather than protecting the affected individuals. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing an erosion of trust, because individuals, the public, feel like no one's looking out for them, that they are just collateral damage. And that's not the way to maintain a trusted relationship. The most important thing in an incident is to make sure that you are protecting the individuals, because you are more able to protect them because you have greater resources, greater control, greater knowledge than they are necessarily able to protect themselves. And they're looking to you for that protection.
Well, I guess, and in that regard, governments are now kind of stepping in maybe a little bit more to try and provide some levels of protection as well. There's been a lot of change around the world, but if we maybe focus on Australia for a moment, because there's been a lot of change in Australia, can you maybe talk us through the changes that have happened and are coming up as well?
Sure. This is a long saga. All of this amendment to the way that we regulate privacy in Australia, it's been under review since about 2019 following the Digital Platforms Inquiry. And since then, we've had discussion papers and issues papers. We've had a full government response. And finally, 4 years and change later, we had the first part of the reform agenda get legislated towards the end of last year. So that gives us 23 amendments to the Privacy Act out of a potential 116 proposals for change. So we've got this first kind of taster platter, and we're expecting the main course later on down the line. It's difficult to say. It could be at the end of this year. It could be later on down.
So in terms of, I guess, what businesses need to know right now or do right now, even with some of the changes that have already flowed through, are you kind of seeing gaps in knowledge or things that people really should now be doing that they're not?
There's a lot of concern over the changes, and there's a lot of uncertainty. I think some of that is misplaced. This first batch of amendments is not huge and it's not earth-shattering. It's stuff that, at least in the privacy industry, we've been talking about for a long time. But there are a few things that I think businesses could be aware of. Let's look at a few of the bigger ticket items. So let's take a look at what those changes look like. The Privacy Act revolves around the Australian privacy principles, and these set out all of the rules that you have to comply with as you move through the data lifecycle. APP 11 deals with security and retention. And for a long time, the standard has been you must take reasonable steps to keep personal information secure. One of the big changes in this first batch of privacy amendments is a clarification in APP 11.3, which says you have to take reasonable technical and organizational steps to keep personal information secure. So what that means is you don't just have to have like technical security controls like a firewall or multi-factor authentication or monitoring on your network. You have to have that, and you need policy, procedures, guidelines. You need a policy framework that sets out how you're going to handle personal information. And that's a gap for a lot of people. There has been a lot of talk about cybersecurity controls and the importance of cybersecurity, and there hasn't been as much regulatory focus on, do you actually have governance in place in your organization? Do you have documentation of how you're going to handle personal information? Because all of that provides you institutional memory. It's very easy for, especially small and medium-sized businesses, to rely on one person as their font of all privacy knowledge. It's often someone like the general counsel or the chief information officer or the chief security officer. But if that person moves on, you lose all of that institutional knowledge unless it is preserved in amber by creating a governance framework. So that's not actually a new change. It's a clarification of a regulatory expectation. But that's the first thing that I think a lot of businesses are going to need to focus on, because now it's enshrined in law. Secondly, one of the other significant amendments in this first tranche has been the proposition to whitelist countries to say, these are safe countries where you can send personal information. Currently, Australian Privacy Principle 8 has some restrictions on sending personal information to overseas recipients. And one of the exceptions where you can do that is where those countries have a comparable legal or regulatory scheme. But it's never been certain which countries do or don't. And what we're seeing in a lot of different countries is privacy laws evolving very, very quickly. So the market's always been a little bit uncertain about where it's safe to send personal data to. What this change does is say the government can effectively say, these are the safe countries, you can send data here without being too concerned. And this is a replication of a European initiative in the General Data Protection Regulation. So as of the date of recording, no countries have actually been declared. But once that happens, it's going to be easier for Australian businesses to send personal data to certain overseas locations. And that will probably be very helpful, because this is one of the things that causes a lot of concern, especially to businesses who are operating online. Then we have a few things that are a little bit more prosaic, so more powers for the regulator, different tiering of the civil penalties that they can apply. I think for smaller and medium businesses, the big change here is the power to issue penalty notices. Prior to the end of last year, if the regulator wanted to issue a civil penalty, what they had to do was go to court. They had to go to federal court and get a civil penalty order. That's expensive to do, and it takes a lot of time. What they can now do is issue a penalty notice, like a speeding ticket, when they see certain administrative issues. So, for example, if your privacy policy is insufficient or doesn't adequately discuss how you are handling personal information, if you fail to be transparent about how you use automated decisions, for example, although that one doesn't kick in until 2026, or if you fail to provide effective direct marketing opt-outs, they don't need to go to court for that. They can just issue a penalty notice. And we've seen how effective this can be in different regulators, like the ACMA, who have been very active in using their penalty notice powers in things like Spam Act compliance and, again, in the direct marketing sector.
Yeah, we've seen them be a lot more active over the last year or so, yeah.
It's a very popular thing to do because everybody hates spam. So, but they've had a lot of impact by just going, you get a penalty notice, you get a penalty notice, and here is our clear statement of expectations of what we want you to do on consent and on opt-outs. So the rules are clear, comply with them, or you will face the consequences. And I've personally seen that drive a big shift in the industry. So there are some opportunities for the OAIC to be more compliance-focused and be more proactive in being a regulation-focused regulator, which is something that the Privacy Commissioner, Carly Kind, has been speaking about lately.
Mm. And you mentioned SMBs before. So obviously at Curiosity, we do talk to a lot of SMBs, and often they come to us for advice in terms of how to navigate the compliance landscape. And one of the things that I actually have heard a few of them say is, I'm an SMB, so I'm exempt. It doesn't actually apply to me. Can you maybe give your perspective on that, and also maybe share the differences between B2B and B2C as well? Because I think that's another area where a lot of people go, well, I'm a B2B and I'm an SMB. I don't deal with personal information.
So let's start with the B2B question, and then we'll move on to the small business question. On the B2B question, whether or not you're covered comes down to the definition of personal information. So in Australia, under the Privacy Act, personal information is defined as any information or opinion about a person who is identified or is reasonably identifiable, irrespective of the format that information is held in. So whether it's on paper or digital, as long as you hold it in a record. So that means that if you're in B2B sales and you have a list of contacts, that information is likely personal information. You've got names, you've got email addresses, you've got phone numbers, you've got place of employment, you've got role title. All of that is linked to an identity, and it may not be as sensitive as other information. So, for example, if my business information gets leaked, so the fact that I'm Tim de Souza, I work at FTI Consulting, my phone number is this, and my email is this, that's probably not too damaging to me because all of that information is online anyway. It is personal, but it's not as sensitive, it's not as dangerous to handle. But it does mean that you do have compliance obligations, even if you are just B2B. So that's the B2B question. The second question you asked was, are smaller businesses exempt? At the moment, the Privacy Act only applies to businesses that have an annual turnover of greater than $3 million. That exempts the vast majority of businesses across Australia. However, one of the proposals in the Privacy Act reform process is to remove that exemption. And so the Privacy Act would apply to all businesses that collect and handle personal information. That is likely to be in the second tranche of amendments. And as I said before, we don't exactly know when that's going to come into place. At the moment, there's a bit of consultation going on about the impacts of this and what the regulator can do and what the government can do to lessen those impacts. But it's generally agreed that this is something that needs to happen because even small businesses are collecting large amounts of personal information. And in the world in which we live, in which cybersecurity is a continuing concern, that there are escalating data breaches, there are escalating scams and escalating attacks on individuals and identity theft, we can't allow large numbers of businesses to be handling personal information without any rules whatsoever. Australia is an outlier in this respect. There are no other jurisdictions with mature privacy regulatory regimes that exempt small businesses in this way. And so when the GDPR came into force in Europe in 2018, there was a big kerfuffle about, oh no, we're going to regulate small businesses to death. And there was a lot of concern and a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety. But after the initial panic, it turned out there wasn't a huge amount that actually needed to be done. And the regulators there spent a lot of time and effort putting out resources, putting out guidance for what small and medium businesses would have to do as a baseline. And I think we'll see a similar process here.
So before we move on to some of the additional changes ACMA is looking at to roll out in December around Sender ID, I'd love to just have a quick chat around the Spam Act and I guess some perceptions around that. Again, talking to customers, sometimes there's a little bit of misunderstanding around when they have to apply an opt-out, for example, whether they need to apply it only for marketing messages or whether there are other types of messages that they need to apply it for. If they've got a customer to expressly opt in, often they feel like that's a blanket opt-in. They can then email them, SMS them about anything that they want. Can you maybe share your perspectives on that and the intent of the Act?
Right. This is where we get to talk about choice and control again. But first, we're going to talk about definitions. So, firstly, the Spam Act applies to commercial electronic messages. And this is any message to an electronic account that has as one of its purposes commercial intent. So let's say you are sending a direct offer, 20% off widgets. Obviously, commercial intent, so that one is a CEM. If you are sending a notification, so by the way, your order of widgets will be delivered on Tuesday, and here's 20% off your next order, then one of the purposes of sending the message was commercial in nature, and it will therefore be a CEM. If it's merely notification or customer relationship administration, so your message just says notification of widgets ready for pickup, and that's it, then it's a designated commercial electronic message, which means it's a notification with no commercial purpose. So if it's a CEM, if it has any sort of commercial purpose or one of its purposes is commercial, then you must have an opt-out and you must have consent to send it in the first place. If it's designated, you don't necessarily need an opt-out. But if you say include a hyperlink in there to your website and your website has offers on it, there's a very good argument that it's a commercial electronic message. So the dividing line needs to be drawn and it needs to be very, very distinct. If you are trying to send a notification or a system message or something along those lines, it cannot have any implication that it is commercial, that you're not trying to provide an offer. So that means whatever you link in there, whether you've got branding on it, you need to consider whether that's going to bring you into the territory of being a commercial message. So yeah, the definitional aspects can be quite difficult, but at the end of the day, the requirements are quite simple. If you're sending marketing messages or commercial messages, you must have consent and you must let people opt out. Those opt-outs have to be effective. And there are timelines for that, but the guiding philosophy is let people choose to receive your messaging and let them give the choice to revoke that consent. And the ACMA has issued some guidelines on what it expects when it's talking about consent. So I would encourage everyone to read the statement of expectations on consent, because it will hopefully provide a little bit of clarity there, but not as much as you might hope, because consent can be a woolly thing. And especially under the Spam Act, you're allowed to have express consent. I say, I absolutely want to receive messages, or implied consent. So I've signed up for your service. One of the conditions of doing that is to receive messages. Therefore, I have agreed through implication and through my actions. But the hard thing about helping clients through regulatory issues with the ACMA is, okay, you've made an argument that you've got implied consent. Prove it. It's very easy to prove express consent because somebody went to a form and filled out their names and clicked a box that said, I agree to receive commercial messages, and then they press submit. Great. We can prove express consent without any difficulty. But implied consent means that we have to argue, well, they signed up for the service and I gave them a little link with the privacy policy in it. The privacy policy is 3,500 words long, and 2 sentences in there say, and by the way, we might send you marketing, and therefore I have implied consent. And a regulator could look at that and go, well, did you have any reasonable expectation that your users were going to read that privacy policy? It was, dense legalese. Do we have any expectation that they are capable of understanding it?
Well, no, and to your point before, it's more about the company covering themselves rather than, the policy being beneficial to the consumer.
Exactly. But the regulator is not necessarily interested in, well, do you have legal coverage? They're interested in, did you effectively communicate what you were doing to your user? Did you sufficiently inform them so they could make an informed decision about what they were doing? Do you have any reasonable expectation that they thought they were going to get messaging? Because the fine print doesn't meet regulator expectations anymore. It's great that you've got fine print, but you're an online business, you served them the privacy policy through a hyperlink, and you know for a fact that most of your users don't click it. And if we know that, then what is incumbent upon us is to take reasonable steps to provide that messaging in a different way, in a way that is more likely to be able to be consumed by the user. So that might look like a just-in-time message or a short collection statement in a web form, something that is easy to read and gets the point across quickly, and then provides them with the opportunity to find more information through the privacy policy or something similar like terms and conditions. But we have to meet people where they are. We know users don't read lengthy privacy policies online, especially though they don't do it on mobile devices because it's small and we're providing many pages of text. So we need to come up with better ways of communicating critical information to them at the right point in time. And that's where all of the regulators are really coming from. They want effective communication, not just legal coverage.
So obviously in the world we live in at the moment, we're starting to see a lot more conversational AI use cases. So not even agents, so conversing with an agent or a bot, more conversational AI where, yes, it's triggered via AI, but there's always a human operator kind of over the top. So because it's kind of more conversational, I know, again, a lot of people are like, it's a conversational, there's a human over the top. It's not really a marketing message. Opt-ins, opt-outs for that? Like I know in some markets, particularly in Europe, they're very vigilant that if you are sending any kind of marketing, even if it's conversational, it comes up in that conversation, you need to be able to provide an opt-out for it. What would be your view on that? Because the conversation might start out operational about their product or service and then move into marketing, upsell, cross-sell later in the one conversation.
That's a really interesting question, and it's a very complicated answer, I'm afraid. So direct marketing is marketing which relies on personal information in order to be targeted, right? So I'm using personal information about you to send you marketing. And maybe that's your email address, or maybe that's the things I know about you from observing your activity online, right? So profiling and targeting and retargeting. But direct marketing is not regulated by one specific piece of legislation in Australia. You've got the Spam Act, which covers email and SMS. You've got the Do Not Call Register Act, which covers telemarketing. And then everything else, which is kind of amorphous, would be covered by the Privacy Act. So I think the use of an AI to conduct direct marketing, well, firstly, it's only going to be direct marketing if it's using personal information in order to carry out the marketing, which means, does the chatbot know who you are? Is it a chatbot that's being delivered in an authenticated environment? So you've logged into the website, the chatbot is part of the network. It knows that you are user 12345. name Tim de Souza, and that you've previously bought the last 10 things you bought, maybe I'm going to start suggesting this in the chat, right? Like that could be direct marketing. But if you're just like an info chatbot, then you've got a user coming in, you probably have some information about their device in their browser, but you don't have identity information, and you're suggesting the products that are most popular to all users. That's arguably not direct marketing.
So what about if you collect information during the discussion? So just say it is an agent sitting on a website. Someone comes in, starts interacting with the agent. They don't supply any, this is my customer number and my password. So they're not actually pulling information from your systems, but the agent does ask them during the conversation for some key information in terms of where they live, how old they are. So through the conversation, they do collect data, and then potentially in that conversation, they try and push them an upsell, cross-sell based on the data they collected. Is that something, because they're using the real-time data? Are you okay because you're not drawing on your own data?
Is it personal? Is it identifiable? So you might have a user tell an agent, I live in XYZ, I'm between 35 and 45, I'm interested in cars, and have the agent cross-sell on that basis. But is the agent able to identify the individual? Is the organization more broadly able to identify the individual? And I think the answer might be no in the hypothetical that you set out, in which case it would not be direct marketing under the definition of the Privacy Act, and it wouldn't be regulated in that way. You wouldn't have to provide an opt-out. But if the agent is part of an authenticated environment, you've had to log into the website, and then you've gone to the help agent, arguably the organization does know who you are, and the agent is a representative, even though it's an artificial representative of the organization. So any information you're providing that agent is potentially logged, potentially connected to your account. All of that's personal. So if it starts cross-selling to you there, you need to be able to tell the agent, I don't want you to sell me stuff, I just want help. Don't sell me stuff. And the agent needs to be able to respect that. This is a brave new world in this respect, because there hasn't been a lot of regulatory commentary on direct marketing through chatbots, but we're certainly going to see it.
And I guess a lot of the legislation hasn't been updated either. So,
well, the legislation tends to be principles-based, so you can read it down to new technology. And the reason it is that way is because the technology advances so quickly. So we can take APP 7, which is around direct marketing, and say, well, if you're using personal information to market, the user has to be able to opt out. And that applies whether it's an old legacy channel like fax marketing or through a new emerging channel like agentic AI.
Yeah, because it's interesting. I was at an advanced analytics roundtable. One of the speakers there was going, it's really interesting because they talk about, whether someone can be reasonably identified. But nowadays, with advanced analytics, it doesn't actually take that many data points to be able to reasonably identify someone.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I guess you would hope that that's not the intent of the legislation, that they're going to try and that they're not out to kind of ping people who are trying to do the right thing by their customers and protect their customers' privacy. If someone you did have a security breach, they did have some kind of advanced analytics capability, they were be able to identify these people.
It's not the intent of the regulator, in my experience, they're not trying to be unreasonably punitive, right? If you can demonstrate to them that you are doing your best, that they don't expect impregnable security, they don't expect perfect steps. The legal standard is reasonable steps. But the problem is what is reasonable changes as technology evolves and as industry practice evolves. So you might say, okay, well, 20 years ago, records were still held in paper, right? A lot of records were still held in paper, and cybersecurity was an emerging industry. What was reasonable then is not going to be reasonable now. Now we expect you to have firewalls and monitoring and multi-factor authentication, and these technologies didn't necessarily exist 20 years ago. So the reasonableness standard changes over time, having regard to what is reasonable technology and what is reasonable industry practice. The hypothetical that you put out, like what happens if my data is stolen and then somebody combines it with other data, that's a real risk. It's a known risk, which means we have to take reasonable steps hedging against that risk. And what that would look like in this case is encryption at rest. My data is in my system, it is encrypted. If it's stolen from me, it's still going to be encrypted. So if I've used sufficient encryption, the malicious attacker will not be able to use that data because we know there's a risk that the data is going to be stolen. That's why this is a reasonable security step. So, yeah, the regulator's not out to be unnecessarily punitive, but they do expect you to react and respond to emerging trends.
Okay. And then I guess on the topic of change, there's just been so much across the board, obviously from a compliance and regulatory point of view as well. The GDPR has always kind of been put forward as the gold standard. I guess in the US it's a bit patchy, you could say. at best. And obviously Australia now with the new privacy legislation and some of the other initiatives that are rolling out like Sender ID, we're kind of starting to uplift to that standard as well. Can you maybe give your perspective on Sender ID, what it means for businesses, and also, I guess, maybe some learnings from other markets as well? So obviously there are a lot of markets that already do have a Sender ID registry up and running.
Yeah, it's worth noting that the GDPR has been the gold standard in privacy since it was enacted in 2018. And we're still chasing it, and a lot of other jurisdictions are still chasing it. It's been incredibly influential in how laws have evolved in the space of privacy, in the space of AI. And we're going to keep on that journey for a little while, I think, because the amendments that we're making here do not necessarily bring us up to GDPR standard, but they're a step in the right direction. In terms of Sender ID, in my view, Sender ID is a direct response to the activities of threat actors, right? We're seeing huge numbers of scams. Scams are exploding, not just in this jurisdiction, but many other jurisdictions. And part of that is the technology keeps evolving and people are uncertain, but the technology is growing ever more flexible and offering more potential. And I think I said it before, but if it offers more potential for us, it offers more potential for them. So Sender ID is directly aimed at trying to cut down on the impersonation because, hey, great, we let people put alphanumeric identifiers on their text messages. Fantastic. Now it's easier for customers to know where your message is coming from because you can say, hey, this is coming from Curiosity. But it turns out that anybody can put anything, which makes impersonations very easy. And we didn't do the education that we needed to customers to say, by the way, just because it says Curiosity on it doesn't mean it's us. And so Sender ID is a direct response to that. At least the customers can trust that a message is coming from who it says it's coming from. At least if we can effectively force telcos to become the police of the identity of messages, then maybe we can reduce the utility of SMS and MMS and RCS to be used for impersonations. And really, we're not absolutely preventing it. There could be ways around this, but we are just raising the bar. Right? We're trying to make it more costly, more difficult for threat actors to use this communications channel in this way. But we've got an entire generation of users that go, oh, a message that says it's from the ATO. That's obviously from the ATO, who are an authority, and I better do what they say. And if that message says, you're behind on your taxes, click this link, put in your MyGov ID and your password, that's incredibly successful. It has a very high strike rate and a very low barrier to entry because no one's been policing the fact that you can put an alphanumeric code as your Sender ID. So this is something that seems relatively small that we could do that would break the business model of threat actors. Of course, it seems relatively small on the user side. On the telco side, it's actually quite a complex bit of network engineering. And there has to be a register of approved senders, and that has to be enforced. So there's a lot of steps that go forth. Now, obviously, we didn't come up with this idea ourselves. We've seen this enacted in Singapore, and it has been difficult for some of the telcos to put in place, but they're managing. The fact of the matter is, whenever you make a regulatory change, it's generally quite painful for the larger providers because the amount of engineering, the amount of systems integration that you have to do can be quite extensive because of their scale. But on the other hand, SMS fraud accounts for 30% of fraud in Australia. It's a massive amount of money that's being stolen from our population. We have to do something about it. And this seems like a reasonable way to be approaching it, in my view anyway.
Oh, look, I don't disagree. I guess the only thing that I often think about is one of the most successful scams was the, hey, mom, hey, dad, I've dropped my phone down the toilet. Can you transfer me? And like that was hugely successful. I mean, I know people that got in my family with that because they're like, oh, it sounded just like my son. Like I never would have guessed it wasn't my son. So I guess that's, the only other thing I think of is, yes, that will help with one use case for scamming, spamming, but I think there's still a whole heap of work we need to do around education to kind of, help people negotiate the other side. And because the spammers and scammers, they just get smarter and smarter, right? So just as businesses are using their data smarter, the scammers are using their data smarter as well.
It's whack-a-mole.
Yeah.
Like, if we make SMS and MMS and RCS less attractive for scammers, they will move to a different channel. This battle will never end, but we still have to fight it.
That's it. I mean, that's the point, right? Like there isn't actually a channel that doesn't have scamming and spamming attached to it. I mean, huge on email, even like this direct mail fraud. You've got door knockers. Like you just can't escape fraud, right? I mean, I know some channels have a better rap than others, but it really is just an epidemic, and that's why the education piece is so important.
There are two sides there. The education piece is absolutely important, but also organizations need to use their power to build their products in a way that are less vulnerable to scamming. And obviously, this is something where we see a lot of focus in financial services, right? The financial services regulators are like, you need to monitor your transactions. You need to proactively identify anomalous transactions. You need to have vulnerable customer programs and be on the lookout for elder abuse. And that can all feel like a lot of pressure and a lot of obligation and a lot of red tape. But this is one of those situations in which with great power comes great responsibility. Only the banks can do that, right? Only organizations that control channels can regulate how those channels are used and inspect how those channels are used. The poor user is out there. They don't have any of those controls. They don't have any of that power. All they have is themselves. They have no institutional power. They have no technical power. So they need to rely on the organizations to protect them. And there's no one else to turn to. So we have to, as people on the inside of these transactions, we have to take that responsibility on because the user has very little power to protect themselves. We can educate them all we like, but ultimately we have more resourcing than they do.
Yeah, and look, I think a lot of companies are kind of starting to pick up the baton as well, because I was talking to a B2B company the other day and they were saying, look, the way we're moving forward with it is we're actually just having closed WhatsApp groups now for our customers. That's how we engage with them. So they know this is it. If you receive information from us through any other source, it's not us, because we're comfortable that we can kind of lock that community down. And the same thing with RCS, because obviously there's verified senders with RCS and people are a lot more comfortable that they can kind of control it a little bit more. Are you thinking that, with some of these new messaging technologies that are coming through, that will also help with the issue above and beyond the government getting more and more involved and rolling out more and more legislation?
Yes, I think those are good and worthy tactics. We've also seen things like instead of banks don't send outgoing emails asking for personal information, but they might send messages to you that you can access from within your app, right? An authenticated environment where you have to sign in with your username and password or with your face, and that you can be sure that the messages coming through you are legitimate. We have to find ways to communicate with people that are less prone to impersonation. And yeah, that's one of the ways to do it.
And given that and the level of complexity and the options available and the different regulatory environments, a lot of companies do actually have a need now to communicate, beyond their local borders, whether you're an Australian company and need to send messaging overseas. How do they navigate that? Do they just have to rely on their messaging partner? Is it something that businesses need to be more aware of?
It's definitely something that businesses need to be more aware of, but it runs us into a very different problem, which is we are operating in a connected globe, a connected world that is governed by national regulation. So we can easily find ourselves as online businesses, as multinational businesses, practicing across several different jurisdictions, and each one of them has a different regulatory regime. So what may be lawful in one regime may be completely different and potentially unlawful and create compliance risk in another. So we're back to regulatory burden. You need to do the work to understand what the laws are in each jurisdiction. And generally speaking, the most effective thing to do is create your own internal set of rules that creates a gold standard for you in your unique position that you can then apply across your business without having to go, oh no, is this illegal in Europe or is this illegal in Indonesia? It's going to be difficult to keep looking for compliance in each location if you are trying to operate a global business. So by at least doing that proactive work and creating your global standard, that puts you in a better position to stay compliant. But then you have to put the work into keeping that up to date. It's just about staying current with the changing environment. I don't have an easy answer, unfortunately. It's just a heap of work.
Look, it is a heap of work. And I think that's certainly where we're adding the value at the moment, where maybe we didn't need to previously, is helping our customers navigate that regulatory environment, particularly across markets that they haven't actually worked in before as well. It seems to be more and more of what we're doing as a messaging platform provider as well, which I guess is just a sign of the times.
Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom. The privacy legislation in general tends to align because it's all coming from a common philosophical background. We don't need to get into ancient history, but generally speaking, they can all more or less match up, and there is maybe about a 5 or 10% difference in things like personal rights or data breach notification reporting deadlines, and where there are some differences. But the core philosophy of providing choice and control, data minimization, privacy by design, and putting in place sensible retention and destroying or de-identifying information you no longer require, these are all common principles across most privacy regimes. So it is more pragmatic and practical to create a baseline standard that gets you to compliance in multiple jurisdictions when it comes to privacy than it is with many other domains.
Okay. And I've heard you in the past talk about the data lifecycle and really use this as a framework to kind of help businesses move through what they need to do at each stage. Can you maybe share your thoughts on that? Because I found it really, really, I guess, a practical way to go, okay, actually, we're really good at this.
In summary, the data lifecycle is around, well, firstly, collection or creation of personal information. So what have I picked up about individuals? What have I used advanced analytics to create information about individuals? And then how you store and secure that information. So where you're putting it, who has access to it, what other security controls you put into it. Is it on premises or is it in the cloud with a third-party service provider? How you use and disclose that information. So am I using this personal information for the purpose I collected it for, or am I using it for other purposes? If I'm using it for other purposes, are those purposes permissible because there are restrictions around secondary uses of information? One of the questions we have right now is how much of this information can we use to train AI? And that's an open question depending on where the information came from and the purpose you collected it for. And then we have obligations around supplier relationships. So who's collecting personal information on my behalf? Who's holding personal information for me? What suppliers am I using to transform personal information? Now, more than ever, all of our businesses are a web of supplier relationships. Cudosity is going to find itself as a supplier to other companies, and then Cudosity has its own suppliers that may handle information on its behalf. And then once we get towards the end of the life cycle, we start talking about end of life. So what information do I no longer require on a day-to-day basis? When should I archive that so I still have it, but it's out of day-to-day access? And when it's no longer useful in an archive, how do I destroy or de-identify that data? Because as the Privacy Commissioner is fond of saying, you cannot lose what you don't have. Plus, we have an obligation to destroy or de-identify information we no longer require for any lawful business purpose. So that end-of-life piece requires you to understand how long you need to keep different classes of information, and then have a system for identifying when those periods have expired, and then have a process for securely destroying or de-identifying the information. So you can't just take your files and throw them in the skip outside your office, which I have seen done many, many times. And you can't necessarily just format a laptop and say, well, that's unrecoverable, because we know that we can often recover data from those kinds of scenarios. We need to have defensible and secure methodologies for disposing of this information in a way that will not be recovered. So that takes you from cradle to grave, to the point where you collect or create the data, to how you store and secure it, how you use and disclose it, and then how you dispose of it when it's no longer useful. And you need to have controls, governance, technology in place at every step of the life cycle to enable you to meet your obligations.
Okay. And you talked a little bit about AI, and we were talking about earlier around, obviously, access to data, being able to use AI to provide even greater levels of hyper-personalization. So we talked a little bit about opt-in, opt-out. But apart from kind of ticking the box from a consent perspective, is there a line in terms of hyper-personalization, use of data and AI, apart from, common sense? Do you think that there's something above and beyond the kind of tick box of consent that we should be thinking about?
You're really asking me the existential question. This is a very difficult one to answer, but I think there are a couple of points to make. Ticking the box is great, but have you adequately set expectations with your users? Because one of the things that we are going to keep running into when it comes to AI and hyper-personalization and chatbots and even the agentic AI stuff that we're seeing now is, are we going to fall into the uncanny valley? This is a concept where if you make something realistic but not realistic enough, it creeps people out. This is a technical term. So we could have a conversational chatbot, but if it falls flat, it's going to annoy people and you'll lose trust. But if you're upfront with people, if you're not pretending to be a person, if you're clear like, hey, I'm a chatbot, I'm going to help you navigate this thing and get you to the right person, then it can be useful to build trust. What we're replacing with chatbots is the old style phone trees. Press 1 for this, press 2 for that, press 3 for that. Users have always hated those, but they do reduce the impacts on human customer service teams, and ultimately that does help you be more efficient. We can replace that very unsatisfying experience with a more satisfying experience. But we have to recognize at the end of the day, the user wants a solution to their problem. If your chatbot can give you a solution, you might get a very good experience out of that. Most of the time, they're calling because they need a human to fix their problem. So if you extend the agentic conversation, then they're just having to argue their way through a robot. They're going to be pretty mad about that. And by the time they get to a human, they're going to spend the first 2 minutes just screaming at that human. And that is a terrible experience for everybody. So we have to make sure that we're finding a balance around cheapness and efficiency and satisfaction. We do have an opportunity here to use this to make things better and not just cheaper. And that's really what we should be going for.
Yeah, and look, I think that's my personal philosophy around it, because I think, yes, a lot of people do want to speak to a human, but then you've got people like me who actually would prefer to speak to an agent. And it depends on what the topic is, right? Like if it's something quick and easy, like I want to reset my password, I don't want to have to wait off the phone to talk to a human to do it if I can do it in 2 seconds with an agent. So it's getting the right blend of human and agent to get the ultimate experience for a customer.
Victor Dominello, who was the digital minister for the New South Wales government, used to have this phrase, the omni-channel approach. And what he was talking about was the people of New South Wales are not a monolith. They don't all want to interact with government in the same way.
That's it.
You need to meet your users where they are, and that means having different approaches for different user groups. There are some users who would love to talk to a human. There are some users who would love to just get the answer from the website. There are some users who want all the functionality in the app. And it's incumbent upon us as service providers to recognize that we need to have a multiplicity of options if we want to be effective in solving user problems and keep users happy. Agentic AI could be a part of that, and it could replace older, less flexible technologies, and it could be a much better option than what we've had previously. But I don't think it can be the only option. That gets us to just being cheaper rather than better. We should be using AI technologies to enhance our approaches and deliver better customer outcomes. If we use them just to deliver cheaper customer outcomes, we will lose trust, and customers will go to someone who will treat them better. I've heard many, many user groups complain about having to navigate their way through the labyrinth of long and lengthy and annoying phone messages and then stay on hold with terrible hold music. You know, every 10 seconds somebody breaks in with an ad. And it's just a terrible experience all around. When they get to a human, the human solves it in 30 seconds. But by that point, they're already irritated. We don't have to be like that. And I think the conversational chatbots do offer a better potential outcome there.
And so we talked a little bit about all the different ways of engaging with a customer. So, you know, whether you're in a product team or an operations team or sales and marketing and you've got a need to engage with customers, how do you align privacy with your customer engagement strategy?
Again, we're going to go back to choice and control. Customers are going to want to hear from you. Some customers are going to want to hear from you, and some customers aren't. And what I often see in the marketing space is people really focusing on, look at the size of our list, it's huge. And then not ever talking about, well, also 30% of the list try to opt out every time we send them a campaign. You are wasting your time, you're wasting your money, and you're squandering trust. You should be focusing on quality over quantity. Quantity is great. You want to have the biggest reach you want, but you want to be reaching the people who want to hear from you. Just forcing messaging does not get you to the outcome you want. It just annoys your customer base. Talk to the people who want to hear from you. Focus on the people who want to hear from you. And that is a better use of your time and money in any case.
Okay. But before we do wrap, I guess just a rapid fire round, what's the biggest privacy myth?
I have a framed Newsweek cover from 1970 that says, "Privacy is dead." And I'm pretty sure that every 5 years they've run a similar headline since then. Time magazine, same deal. Privacy is not dead. It's more important than ever. It is definitely becoming more complicated.
Okay. And most underrated privacy practice?
Data minimization. Don't collect what you don't need. Don't keep what you don't need.
Okay. And what's one thing that any founder or chief product officer or chief marketing officer should do today?
Make sure you have access to the right kind of privacy advice. If you don't have a in-house privacy person, get an external one. Make sure that your GC or your CIO can call someone if they need help.
But I guess the key takeout being privacy isn't just about regulation. It's becoming a design signal for trust as well as a competitive differentiator when done well. So, Tim, thank you again.
Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, if you are rethinking how privacy fits into your messaging, CX or AI roadmap, start early, build it in, and make it a feature, not a footnote. You can visit codosity.com for a range of tools and checklists to help you navigate the regulatory environment. And I believe, Tim, we might also have a few assets from FTI Consulting available as well.
Almost certainly.
Fantastic. Okay, well, until next time, stay curious and stay private. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tori.
The Simplicity Effect, proudly sponsored by Codosity.